Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, Corey. Welcome, everybody. We will jump into it again today. We're going to hear a lot about invasives and providing updates on our science that support resource management partners. So our first speaker today is Stephen Boyte from our EROS, Earth Resources Observation Science Center. And today, Stephen's going to talk to us about a long ongoing project aimed at mapping invasive annual grasses in near real time. So Steve, we can see your slides. I can see your face. I heard your voice. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm going to hide this stop sharing note, so it's covering my notes, and I need my notes. So I'm going to get going right away. Thank you for the introduction, Leaf. I'm going to hop right into my second slide and acknowledge the funders. Fire and Aviation and Wildlife from the BLM, those programs have long supported this project, as has the USGS National Land Imaging and Land Change Science programs. A shout out to the BLM AIM program. They do the dirty work of getting out in the field and getting field plot data that we use in our exotic annual grass modeling and mapping, and then acknowledging my team members because they provide a lot of the hard work and talent that develops these models and maps. So we develop and make it publicly available during the spring and early summer expedited annual grass and distribution and abundance data. We do this in a spatially explicit format. That's going to be a problem. These maps are developed and made available as early as mid-April and can be used to understand generally or even specifically what the exotic annual grass abundance estimate looks like on a weekly basis. This time series of maps measures exotic annual grass variability weekly and shows progression of exotic annual grasses through their life cycle. We can also mark the timing of critical thresholds of exotic annual grass abundance using these data. For example, later I will show maps that identify when a pixel reaches a 10% threshold of abundance. We also develop a time series of phenology metrics that can reveal disturbances, a changing climate, and changing species dominance. Let's see here. So this is our study area here within the bounding box. It covers a large chunk of the western U.S. We define rangelands using the National Land Cover Database, or NLCD database. And if they classify a pixel as shrub or grassland herbaceous, then we identify it as rangelands. Now, we have one other threshold that we identify, and that is 2,350 meters in elevation above sea level. If the pixel goes above that elevation threshold, then we mask it out because we don't have enough training data at the higher elevations to build a robust model. But the study is built on remote sensing data and then that AIM training data that we use. The remote sensing data we use is harmonized Landsat Sentinel data, 30-meter spatial resolution. We use two bands, the infrared band and the red band, to develop a normalized difference vegetation index. And we do that because it serves as a proxy for vegetation greenness and provides a measure of plant health. This part of the country, at least the northern part, or especially the northern part, I should say, has quite a few clouds that mar the satellite images during this time of the year. And so we use a deep learning model to develop cloud-free NDVI. And as I said before, it's a strong predictor of EAG, or exotic annual grass abundance. And we develop these NDVI data on a weekly composite basis. And that provides up-to-date responses that we use to inform the model of changing vegetation conditions. To build the EAG model, we, of course, like I said, use that field plot data from the BLM AIM program. And we use a regression tree model to predict the exotic annual grass abundance. And we use these listed ecological, environmental, topographical, and remotely sensed data as independent variables in the model. So this is the scatter plots that show the comparison of the model accuracy metrics for EAGs from 2022 through 24. The models are relatively strong with very stable R values and stable median absolute errors across the 3 years. To maximize the use of the relatively few data points that we have, while we have about 35 to 40,000 data points from the AIM program, there's millions of pixels that we're trying to train. So we have to be careful that we want to use as many training points as we can to build the model. So we used a cross-validation technique to determine model accuracy. And we did that by first withholding a unique 20% of the reference data as testing data, and then train the model with the remaining 80%. Then we returned the withheld testing data back to the reference data set and withheld another unique 20% of the data as testing data and reran the model with the remaining 80%. This process was repeated until 5 unique models had been developed. And those 5 model outputs were used to create 5 maps that were then averaged for a final map. And this process is one that we followed for all of the 10 weekly expedited early or estimated exotic annual grass that we developed. Where's my cursor? So this slide shows 2 of the very early season 2024 weekly maps of the expedited early estimates. And we also put a difference map in there on the right. That difference map shows the change in pixel values between the 2 weekly maps. And on the difference maps, you can see the values of the two weekly maps are quite a bit different in the northern half of the study area. Up here in the right corner, upper right corner, is the northwestern Great Plains ecoregion. And then you've got quite a bit of change in the Snake River Plain, and then in the northern basin and range and the north part of the Great Basin. So these 2 maps are quite different, and they show early season growth and potential curing earlier than normal. As I said, large areas of the Snake River Plain and the Great Basin show substantial intensification in abundance as well. The southern part of the study area does not show nearly the dynamic change that the northern region did. So this is the slideshow, or this slide shows the last 2 weekly maps of the early estimates for 2024, and again, another associated change map. Now on this change map, you can see that the estimated values were much less dynamic than the difference map shown on the previous slide. As the growing season for exotic annual grass ramps down, other vegetation types growing seasons are ramping up and could be the cause of the inversely related phenomena. Finally, this slide shows the first and last weekly expedited exotic annual grass maps for 24. As expected, they show that the most broad-based substantial change to date and the intensification of abundance is apparent in the Northwest Great Plains ecoregion, and then again in the Snake River Plain and the Great Basin as well. We also have this area down here, a collection of smaller ecoregions down in this near the lower right corner that shows quite a bit of change as well. So this is the 10% cover threshold I was talking about earlier. We found in a paper that we published in 2021 led by Neil Pastick that reaching a 10% threshold in the Great Basin can increase fire activity. So these 3 maps show the pixels that reached a 10% exotic annual grass cover from the 3 years shown here. Now, if the pixel is gray, then it did not reach 10%, the 10% threshold. Of the pixels that reached that 10% threshold, most did by the middle of May in all 3 years that are displayed. That Northwest Great Plains ecoregion in the upper right corner of the map had most of its area reach the 10% threshold in all 3 years. And it showed the highest variability in timing in 22 and 24. This area down here, this collection of smaller ecoregions, it had quite a bit of variability in the timing as well, but it did not have as many of the pixels that reach that 10% threshold. So now we're going to move to the phenology metrics of exotic annual grasses real briefly. This is a conceptual diagram that shows phenology metrics that we developed for the study area. The start of season time and end of season time data sets are developed using a regression tree model and provide the time frame within which the rest of the indices are calculated. For example, duration measures the number of weeks between the start of season time and the end of season time for a pixel, and the max N, or maximum NDVI, identifies the highest NDVI value that occurs between SOST and EOST. Good, the animation is working with this in this form. This video animation demonstrates a substantial variability both spatially and temporally of the start of season time metric from 2017 to 2023. The accuracies for both the scatter plots shown, or the models here, are very strong, with about a half of a week of the SOST model, the median absolute error equal to a half a week, and the median absolute error equal to about a third of a week in the EOST model. And the correlation coefficients are very strong, both in the 90s. So future plans, we're going to continue developing 10 weekly exotic annual grass data sets from mid-April to mid-June on an expedited schedule. That expedited schedule gives land managers an opportunity to see what potentially is coming down the pike as far as exotic annual grass abundances and distributions, and it helps them, in some cases, pre-position firefighting resources and to validate and measure previous vegetation treatments. We also plan to increase the model's robustness by adding future AIM data points to the training data set. And we are in the process of exploring the fusion of multiple satellite data sources to develop more accurate exotic annual grass models and maps. We're going to add some, we're testing hyperspectral data and superspectral data for future applications. To access this data, if you go to the Science-Based Catalog, which is a USGS repository for data, and type in rangeland exotic plant monitoring, you should be taken right to our page where you can download the data. Or you can go to the mrlc.gov page and download the data there as well. Now, this is the last slide. I just want to leave you with some associated papers that we have published since 2022, in case you have any interest in learning more about our process and what we're doing. And that's all I have. So if anybody has any questions, or if we have time for questions, I don't know.
On to our next speaker. So Morgan Roche from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center is going to talk to us about another multi-year project. So this is really assessing the proliferation of fine fuels and the connectivity of those fuels. And there's been a couple of subsequent phases of this project that look at integration with climate, as well as expansion of where they're doing this work. So looking forward for this update. Morgan, I can see your slides. I did see your face a moment ago. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm one of those folks that's affected by the internet outages. So yell if I go out. Yeah, I'm Morgan Roche. I am at US Geological Survey Fort Collins Science Center. And I'm going to be talking about this series of projects on proliferation of invasive fine fuels. Take a peek at our project webpage with this QR code if you're interested in. But first, I'd like to thank our funding partners and collaborators. Without them, these projects wouldn't have been possible, including BLM Rangelands and Fire Aviation, USGS Biothreats and Ecosystems, the Natural Resources Ecology Lab at CSU, the USGS Southwest CASC, and also our fantastic partners, Lindy Garner, Seth Flanagan, and Megan McLaughlin. So I'm not going to do too much intro since we all understand the system, but invasive annual grasses have increased fine fuel connectivity and wildfire frequency in sagebrush ecosystems that in the past typically had this small infrequent wildfires for much of the range. And this has altered the fire regime to one that doesn't favor native vegetation. So after fires, after fires, these slow-growing native vegetation species, such as sagebrush, have a hard time reestablishing due to that grass fire cycle, which threatens these sagebrush ecosystems. So we're all aware this is a massive management challenge, basically due to the vast expanse of areas invaded and the areas at risk of future invasion. So the work I'm presenting today is part of this pretty large project working to understand proliferation, connectivity, and consequences of invasive fine fuels. And to just nod towards some of these other work, Helen Sofair led a project to identify areas at low versus high risk of a potential cheatgrass abundance. And then Aaron Buchholz led 2 projects, one applying Helen's risk maps to future disturbance scenarios, and another in which she characterized connectivity of fine fuels. So the first and third of these are published. The second is hoping to be out this year. So feel free to take a look at those, and Leif will provide links later on. But I'm going to be discussing projects 4 and 5 on this list in detail. And the first one, we described rates of change in invasive annual grass cover with implications for potential management options. And then the second one, we assess the factors associated with rates of change. And then I'm going to give you a little preview of number 6, in which we projected rates of change into the future. So first, looking about how describing rates of change in invasive annual grass cover. So in other words, how much and how quickly is invasive annual grass cover changing over time? And we wanted to see if that metric could be used to inform placement of potential management opportunities in sage systems. So there are a lot of invasive annual grass abundance maps out there, and they're amazing resources. They help us identify where invasive annual grasses are and approximate the cover of them, but they do miss some information. So rates of change calculated from those maps can provide a temporal nuance to percent cover maps. So for example, these are 2 maps of percent cover of invasive annual grasses outside of Helena, Montana. So they have pretty similar overall percent cover between 1987 and 1991. And if you look at these maps, we'd probably treat them fairly similarly in terms of management because they look pretty much the same. But if we add information about rates of change, that picture can change a lot. So these graphs represent the average rate of change in percent cover of invasive annual grasses across each site for each 5-year time period between 1987 and 2021. Any value greater than 0 means the cover is increased. Anything below 0 means that cover is decreased. And the bigger that absolute value of that point means that that's happening faster. So this is pretty clear that the average rates of change in cover across these sites is quite different. The top one kind of stays around 0. It's not changing very much. Whereas the bottom site has a rate of change that's often quite positive and often quite high. And then if I show the percent cover data from 2017 to 2021, it's pretty clear that the invasion situations in these 2 places are quite different. Bottom site is quite a bit more severely invaded now. So looking at rates of change early on could have been an early sign that something was changing at that bottom site and it was starting to transition to an invaded state, could have been a potential opportunity to intervene. So we calculated rates of change in cover over 5-year time intervals across the sagebrush biome using rangeland condition monitoring, assessment, and projection data, also known as RC-MAP. This estimates fractional components of multiple components of rangeland vegetation. For this project, we used the annual herbaceous cover because to approximate invasive annual grass cover, because this layer is composed of mostly invasive annual grasses. So we calculated the annual difference in cover and averaged that over 5 years, basically to decrease the sensitivity of year-to-year fluctuation in annual vegetation. So this allowed us to focus on kind of longer term, not long-term, but longer term trends. And I want to highlight here that rates of change this way represents changes in cover within locations, not spread over space. So this is what this can look like. This is a series of maps that shows the rate of change calculated for each 5-year time period. And for visualization, it's binned into positive, neutral, and negative rates of change. So where it's increasing, not changing, and where cover is decreasing. So this essentially shows us the history of rates of change in cover. So these maps could be used to understand the historical patterns of invasion in places that you work. You can see that some places are quite stable, others have pretty dramatic fluctuations. And I'm going to move over this part pretty quickly, but if you want more information, this work was recently published in Rangeland. So take a look at that paper, please. The really cool part about this information is that information on rates of change can be combined with percent cover to categorize places into different invasion situations and help inform different potential opportunities for management. So this triangle represents the decision space between protect, contain, and treat using a combination of invasive annual grass cover and data on rates of change that we calculated. And of course, the local invasion context and local needs are hugely important when deciding on a potential strategy. So we've categorized places with high invasive annual grass cover and relatively high rates of change for potential containment. So in these places, isolation, preventing fire transmission are things that could be done in order to reduce invasive annual grass spread from these pretty degraded locations. On the other hand, we categorize places for protect as places with pretty low cover that are not increasing cover. So they're slightly invaded, but they're stable or decreasing. They're not really problematic right now. And in these places, monitoring for changes in conditions and preventing disturbance could be prioritized to limit new invasions in these places that are right now invaded but relatively intact. And then finally, we assign treat to places where cover is low or relatively low, but rate of change is high and positive. So these places don't look like they're that bad right now, like that. They look more like the bottom of the Helena example. They don't look like that bad, but their rates of change are high. So they're possibly trending in a undesirable direction. So perhaps treatment, restoration actions could be ways to prevent it from achieving that high cover in the future and maintaining ecological function. So we applied this decision triangle to the landscape with ecologically relevant thresholds. And I want to note that these thresholds could be pretty easily adjusted to meet local needs and priorities, depending on what those are. Here I've highlighted a couple of locations, one in Montana and one in Oregon, to show some of the details of this map. So you can see from this that the invasion condition in these two locations is quite a bit different. There's a much more advanced invasion landscape in southern Montana. And this map, the thing that it does is it shows the invasion spatial context, but what it doesn't get at is incorporating other priorities that managers may have. So what we're hoping is that this map is designed to be used at relatively broad scales and in context with local information and priorities. So you could take this map and overlay it with any priority that you have, such as sage-grouse seasonal habitat models, migration corridors, whatever that priority for your management unit is. And then you can use those pieces of information together to further narrow down decisions on where to work. So our next step in this project was to try to identify those underlying drivers of rates of change and cover. So, and and how those factors might vary across heterogeneous sagebrush ecosystems. We're looking at such a large spatial scale that we don't really expect the same factor to have the same effect in places like southern Nevada as in western Montana. Those places are hugely different. They have different disturbance regimes. They have different vegetation communities, different climatic conditions, and all of that could affect how quickly invasive annual grass cover is changing. We're working to understand the factors associated with different rates of change. We're doing this with a spatial generalized additive model with a suite of anthropogenic and environmental variables. And that the model incorporates space to kind of tell us how those relationships vary over space. This allows us to see both the effects of each factor, but how the strength and direction of the effect changes across the landscape. We found all of these variables by scoping the literature and also consulting our management partners from BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service to create this list of factors that are known and suspected to impact invasive annual grass invasion. So, for example, from experimental work, we know that invasive annual grasses are associated with some human infrastructure disturbance. We also know they can outcompete native vegetation in pretty hot and dry spring conditions. We know that following wildfire, they can rapidly increase in cover. And generally, we know that perennial herbaceous vegetation, established perennial herbaceous vegetation, is fairly competitive against invasive annual grasses. So I'm first going to show the individual effects of each variable on rates of change. These represent the global effect of each individual variable. They're all on the same scale, but you'll note that the axes are all different. So just pay attention to that as you're kind of glancing over this. So you might see that many of these overall patterns are consistent with patterns on invasive annual grasses. So rates of change are elevated under high summer temperatures, elevated under high drought severity, and they're suppressed with higher summer precipitation. Also, immediately following wildfire, rates of change are elevated, but that effect diminishes over time, which is consistent with what we see in the literature, and becomes more similar to unburned as time goes on. So I'm just going to focus on perennial herbaceous cover, just so we have only one thing to think about for a little bit. Low perennial herbaceous cover is associated with elevated rates of change, and it decreases as perennial herbaceous cover increases until it's very high. So individual effects, though, in local places are expected to vary greatly due to the combination of local environmental factors. So although this is the global effect, we don't expect that global effect to necessarily be the same pattern everywhere. So we can use our model to identify places where changes in any of these factors can meaningfully change invasion. So for example, we created a sensitivity analysis where we increased perennial cover by 10% to simulate the effects of something like a restoration action by increasing perennial cover, and to see how that effect varied over space. So we did this just for the small area. It's one of 5 sagebrush collaborative restoration landscapes put together by the DOI Sagebrush Keystone Initiative team. Orange colors here indicate where a 10% increase in perennial cover is predicted to accelerate rates of change, and teal colors indicate where an increase in perennial grass cover decelerates rates of change. And then that gray in between shows where there isn't much sensitivity to changes in perennial cover. So the teal locations represent predicted opportunities to decelerate rates of change by bumping up perennial grass cover. And you can see how much that pattern varies given where each location is on the range of perennial herbaceous cover and the interaction with space and other ecological variables. So we can also use our model to predict what the rate of change might be if a currently uninvaded location were to become invaded. So for this scenario, we simulated a 5% invasive annual grass cover where there's currently 0. So red places here would represent areas that are at risk of a positive rate of change if invaded. So these are areas that could be prioritized for early detection, rapid response, and monitoring, because cover is expected to increase rapidly if invasive annual grasses were to establish in that location. So we've also modified this analysis to identify where future climate and disturbance conditions could accelerate versus decelerate rates of change in invasive annual grasses. And so the potential implications of this is that with the best guess of where rates of change will be similar versus different in future conditions, we can help inform durable management decisions that can be adaptive to these changes in conditions. So I'm presenting some preliminary results on this at the Society for Range Management meeting next week. So come hear about that if you're going to be there. Overall, rates of change add important temporal information on invasion trajectories that could inform management decisions. We've identified some locations across the biome that have urgent treatment needs, but there are also a lot of areas that could be prioritized for containment or monitoring, which may take up fewer resources. Finally, understanding the effects and spatial variation of factors we know to be associated with rates of change can help inform potential locations and courses of action. There's a huge list of our deliverables. These can also all be found on our project webpage. And yeah, I also have the contact information for all the project leads if you have more questions. Thanks.
Here's Bryan Tarbox from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. And today, Bryan's going to be talking to us about optimizing sagebrush restoration and management actions to increase connectivity. There you go.
Yeah,
That's great.
I was trying to get
I
my
see your slides, I
link
hear
in the
your
chat.
voice, I see your face. The floor is yours.
Cool. All right, thanks for the intro. I'm going to be talking about 3 different projects today, so you're going to kind of get just a little bit of each of them. But I'll be focused on the sagebrush recovery stuff we recently released, and then some other projects that are in progress and building off of that work. So thanks to our funders and collaborators and everyone, WLCI, BLM, CSU, and of course, Sage and Fire Research. Yeah, everyone knows the sagebrush biome is under threat, but what do we do about it? So restoration can be challenging in terms of meeting objectives. It can be difficult. It can take a long time. Sagebrush is a slow-growing plant that can take up to 100 years to recover in some cases. And all of this costs money. On top of that, the sagebrush biome is very large, and so there's a lot of variability in the conditions that can influence outcomes. So trying to make recommendations across the biome can be challenging. So to try and help out with that, we've got our first project was aimed at modeling sagebrush recovery and the effect of restoration treatments to then produce spatially explicit maps that could be used to guide restoration that have restoration and recovery rates. The next project, the objectives of that, this is actually 2 projects that are ongoing. And basically what we're doing, the objective with those is to apply the same modeling framework we used for sagebrush recovery to model the response of other vegetation components in the system, such as herbaceous cover. And there are 2 different projects, one that Erica is going to talk on after me, and then one I'll be touching on briefly that's more focused specifically on invasive annual grasses. And then finally, there's another project where we take all the inputs of this of these other projects and feed them into optimization models so that we can potentially guide management of sagebrush ecosystems across spatial scales, and specifically in that project aimed at doing that within the context of the sagebrush conservation design. So briefly how we did this, this is from the sagebrush recovery modeling paper that's out now. And so we use vegetation data from RC map, which we used for covariates that inform the models, as well as response variables focusing on sagebrush cover in this case, but the other vegetation components in the other projects. And then we brought in treatment data from a couple of different data libraries, the Land Treatment Digital Library, Conservation Efforts Database, and Utah's Watershed Restoration Initiative. We also brought in wildfire data and some soil climate normals from Mike O'Donnell and Dan Manier's product that was released here at Florida a year or 2 ago. And to do this, we used a stratified sampling design rather than trying to model all however many million or billion pixels across this biome. We use a stratified sampling approach, looking at across wildfire boundaries as well as project boundaries where there had been some sort of effort to restore sagebrush or another disturbance besides wildfire, to get treatments to sample sites that were both treated and untreated so that we'd be able to mitigate for selection bias of treatments to some extent. So first we modeled sagebrush recovery just on its own, natural recovery, no treatment. And you can look up the results of that in our paper. But for this quick presentation here, I'm going to focus on the treatment effects. And so these graphs are showing the effects of aerial seeding of different seed mixes and then drill seeding of different seed mixes. And the y-axis there is basically trying to show the effect of these treatments compared to no treatment or natural recovery that would just be happening in the background. So anything above the black line is showing a positive effect on sagebrush cover compared to not doing anything and just letting sagebrush cover return on its own. And then the x-axis is a gradient of spring soil moisture, with the left being more arid sites and the right being more mesic sites. And so one of the things that jumps out at you most quickly here probably is that the drill seeding tended to have a more noticeable positive impact on sagebrush recovery rates, the graph on the right. Aerial seeding did have an effect, though. It did tend to improve sagebrush recovery rates, but that varied by seed mix. And so seed mixes that were just Artemisia or native grass or a combination of the two tended to have more of an impact at drier sites than wetter sites, whereas seed mixes of Artemisia and introduced grasses tended to have a more positive impact at wetter sites. We do caution, though, that we also found negative effects of introduced grasses being seeded. You can kind of see that on the right graph here on the left side, that little green dot. Just being the negative impacts, especially at those drier sites, potentially of introduced grasses, especially if they're seeded on their own. We then took these models and used them to project sagebrush recovery after a simulated wildfire. We ran 100 simulations for each of the different treatment treatments that we modeled. And then we did this 30 years out into the future after a simulated wildfire. And that's sort of a short amount of time for sagebrush recovery. You know, like I said earlier, they can take up to 100 years in some cases. But because all the conditions that influence sagebrush recovery are changing, we wanted to wait until we had future projections of things like soil climate normals before we projected any further out into the future than 30 years. So in this iteration of the project, we're a little more limited here on the time frame. And so with that caveat in mind, on the left, we've got simulated sagebrush cover 30 years after wildfire, showing where there's recovery up to 35% sagebrush cover, starting from, you know, the simulated destructive wildfire that knocks it all out, basically. And then most interestingly, and this is what we're really excited about, is the graph, the map on the right there, showing these kind of peripheral regions. So what we're showing here is the difference in outcomes from sites that are seeded with Artemisia compared to sites that receive no treatment. And so you can find these areas on the left over here where natural recovery or maybe a passive restoration effort might be pretty effective there under those conditions. Whereas then you can target these peripheral regions and other areas where you have the most effect of that restoration treatment compared to not doing anything. So that could really help improve efficiency of restoration efforts by guiding restoration towards these areas where, you know, more active and potentially expensive restoration would be needed and effective. So the next project is trying to model efficacy of cheatgrass treatments using a similar framework, but we have, when we first did that sagebrush recovery modeling project, a lot of the data sets we used for that have been updated multiple times since then. So we've now updated our sample and trying to bring in as much data as we can so we can really get a robust data set to work with for this effort. And so the goal here is to produce similar sorts of graphs and maps showing the effects of different treatments on cheatgrass cover. And we have obviously a sort of different modeling framework here. You know, there are some tweaks because cheatgrass is, of course, going to respond differently to different conditions and different treatments. So we're still in the process of tweaking those models and getting that figured out. But we hope to have some maps that can guide management of cheatgrass, similar to the map I was just showing for sagebrush restoration. And then finally, there's another project that's in the works, but we're waiting on some of these other projects to finish with producing their outputs so that we can feed them into this effort. And this is an optimization effort. So the idea here is we take some of those inputs on treatment efficacy, and then we bring it into a modeling framework that we have used previously in other projects. The kind of overarching name of that is Preset, or the Prioritizing Restoration of Sagebrush Ecosystems tool. You can look that up online. Maybe Cam can throw a link in there. Pretty easy to find, Preset USGS. The way that works, and so first I'll say that these maps here are just examples from a project we've just completed in Northwest Colorado. But for this project, we'll be doing this across the biome. And so it starts off with planning units. They tell you where the model is going to consider places for prioritization. And so the idea here is that we would be trying to inform management to potentially improve or restore connectivity between core sagebrush areas. So this map is showing core sagebrush areas in dark blue and growth opportunity areas in light blue. So we'd be looking in those growth opportunity areas to try and help improve connectivity between the darker blue areas. And you can bring in a bunch of different feature layers that can help you meet various different conservation or restoration objectives. In this example, one of the things would be sagebrush connectivity loss. So we have estimates of where sage connectivity was high in the past and where it's been lost over time. So we can target those areas. And then we bring in our cost layers, and this really guides the prioritization to areas where you're expected to have success. And so that's the value of those outputs from the previous projects. We can say, okay, these are areas where sagebrush cover is expected to be high if we do a seeding treatment out here. So there's a high probability of restoration success. We can use that to guide the prioritization model so that it's restoring lost connectivity to meet or other wildlife objectives within those growth opportunity areas to areas where we actually expect restoration success. And we'll spit out the solution. So we've completed the sagebrush recovery project. Those are the data layers for that are 300-meter resolution raster data. They're on ScienceBase. This is the URL here, and I put all the links in the chat just a minute ago. We've also got a manuscript out in landscape ecology. It's open access, so you should be able to access that without any issue, but feel free to reach out to me if you have some trouble with it. And like I said, that has a bunch of the other results from our paper. I didn't really have time to get into them all here, but some of the environmental covariates. So what are the other vegetation components? How do they influence restoration outcomes and spring soil moisture and things like that? In progress are the treatment projections for cheatgrass, which will be on ScienceBase as well when we're done with those, as well as an associated manuscript. And then the prioritized sites for improving connectivity of those core sagebrush areas with an associated manuscript as well. And I kind of talked about the proposed applications a little bit on that slide with the maps, but I think that's a great example of how these can be used. So you can say, those areas where there was a high probability of natural recovery, those might be great opportunities for more passive restoration, maybe fencing them off or something like that, but not necessarily investing as much resources in terms of seeding efforts. And then the map on the right that I showed previously, you could say, okay, these are where you really get that kind of your best bang for your buck from doing a more expensive restoration treatment or active restoration. And so this can help managers apply frameworks like resist, accept, direct, and also contribute to cost effectiveness analyses. And additionally, it can also target specific restoration treatments. We modeled the effective aerial seeding versus ground seeding versus planting seedlings. And then with the cheatgrass management project, we'll also be looking at different combinations of herbicide treatments and things like that. And then all this feeds into the prioritization project. And so those outputs, the value of those is they take those outputs of where is restoration most likely to be effective, and then you can bring in other considerations like where is it going to be effective, but also restore lost connectivity or meet some other objective related to focal wildlife species or something like that. And thanks again. This is our contact information is at the bottom. That's the main website for the sagebrush recovery stuff. And all the links are in the chat. So
our next speaker is Erica Christensen from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. And Erica's going to be telling us today about simulating trends in land health components under different treatment scenarios and integration with the sagebrush conservation design. So Erica, I can see your slides. They're not in presentation. We're good. I can see your face. I can hear your voice. I can see your slides. The floor is yours.
Great. So I'm one of the ones with internet connectivity problems. So hopefully this will let me stay on for my entire talk. But if not, I apologize in advance. So I'm Erica Christensen from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. And I'm going to be talking about that expansion that Bryan just talked about. Simulating vegetation trajectories under restoration treatment scenarios. First, I want to acknowledge funders and collaborators. the USGS Sagebrush Ecosystem and Rangeland Fire Science Group, the Bureau of Land Management, and of course my co-authors are Adrian Monroe, Bryan Tarbox, and Cameron Aldridge. So I think I can skate right past this background since Bryan already talked about the previous project. So again, just saying that this work is building off of that, where he was just focusing on the sagebrush component after recovery. Whereas this project is going to expand into these multiple components of land cover. So specifically, we're going to be looking at annual herbaceous, bare ground cover, perennial herbaceous, and non-sage shrubs. And what we're going to do in this project is run those trend models to try and figure out the effects of those restoration actions. And then following up, simulating cover of these different components following wildfire with and without restoration actions. And our final objective is to work with stakeholders to identify restoration actions of particular interest that we can then evaluate and simulate. So a quick reminder, the data that we used consisted of a large database of restoration treatments, combining that with RCMap remotely sensed vegetation products. And Bryan's analysis found that one of the most successful treatments was drill seeding. So this is a simplification of what Bryan just showed us, basically just showing that sagebrush on the y-axis is either increasing or decreasing with the treatment compared to a non-treatment scenario. On the x-axis is the moisture gradient, and the three different colors represent different seed mixes of the treatment. So we have an artemisia only, a native grass only, and then a combination seed mixture. And we can already see with this figure that there's going to be some effects of between seed mix and moisture. When we look at the analysis with perennial herbaceous cover responding to the same treatments, we see that the artemisia only seeding treatment tends to result in decreased perennial herbaceous cover, especially at those more mesic sites. Whereas when the seed mix includes native grasses, those effects are more overlapping with zero. So really a more neutral effect of the treatment on perennial herbaceous cover. And finally, when we are looking at these effects on annual herbaceous cover, again, we get a lot of confidence intervals overlapping zero. We have some above the zero line and below the zero line effects. So we might have some small positive or negative effects of annual herbaceous cover. And this is, again, where the effect of drill seeding, which is specifically targeting artemisia regrowth. In another aspect of this project, we're looking at restoration actions besides seeding. So here I'm showing two treatments, weed control and vegetation disturbance. So weed control specifically refers to trying to control those annual invasive grasses, whereas vegetation disturbance is really more targeting woody encroachment, juniper removal type of treatments. And what Bryan et al. Saw with their sagebrush analysis was that these two treatments really had very minor effects on either increasing or decreasing sagebrush following the treatment. Comparing that to the response of perennial herbaceous, there's more of an effect. So especially at those more arid sites that include vegetation disturbance, we're seeing a net benefit for perennial herbaceous cover. And again, the moisture gradient is important when you're considering these effects. And those effects are even greater when you're looking at the response of annual herbaceous cover. So here the moisture gradient is extremely important. And you're actually seeing quite a bit of increased annual herbaceous cover at drier sites with vegetation disturbance treatment applied, which agrees with some other information that we have. And finally, this project is really at the beginning. So far, we're seeing that these treatments, even treatments that are specifically targeting artemisia, are having mixed positive and negative effects on different vegetation types. That moisture gradient and the seed mix of the different treatments is extremely important. And so for our next steps, we want to continue running simulations like Bryan showed to actually predict cover of not only sagebrush, but all 5 of the different cover components that I talked about to create maps. And especially we want to connect with stakeholders at this point to identify treatment scenarios that are most important to simulate that would help guide management practices. So if you're interested in getting in touch with me, here's my contact information and for anyone on the team. And that is what I have so far.
So our next speaker is Cameron Aldridge, also from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. And today, Cam is going to be talking to us about a biome-wide vegetation change monitoring and warning system. So Cam, I can see your face. I can see your slides.
Awesome. Thanks, Leif. Welcome, everyone. So this is going to be a quick lightning talk too on a project we're just getting underway. We're trying to develop a biome-wide vegetation change and monitoring and warning system for the sagebrush biome. I'd like to acknowledge USGS and the BLM, particularly the wildlife program, who have supported this work. And then we have some ongoing science that's supporting feeding into this that's been funded by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also recognize our partners at Colorado State University. I'm just posting in the chat right now the link to this QR code if you want for our broader SAGE page, where you can look up some of the science associated with this effort. So, as many of you know, the sagebrush conservation design was developed to get to this broad framework for characterizing habitats based on intact sagebrush, defining those core areas, considering things like threats from human modifications and invasive annual grasses. And this really recognized the need to maintain these intact and functioning ecosystems that support a variety of ecosystem services within the sagebrush biome, including the wildlife like sage-grouse that depend on it. So have some really amazing tools. We've heard about the RAP in the past, the rangeland analysis platform, and then also a lot about RCMap today. And these RCMap fractional components, time series, much like RAP, really allow us to begin to monitor system changes, and both by comparing the components of vegetation responses and consider how things like drought may actually have impacts or changing these systems. So we've got moisture, soil moisture availability, and how vegetation may respond. And Bryan and others alluded to those in this session as well. And we can explore potential forecasts on how climate simulations may actually affect the future of these resource conditions going forward. So this is really building upon this science. There's this rangeland, or this restoration outcomes assessment framework that Leif is actually leading. And it takes the science and the need to better understand how potentially restore degraded systems, like in the sagebrush biome. So USGS recently initiated this ROFE effort. There's 2 main objectives. The first is to build a foundational cross-bureau framework with shared measures across DOI for really assessing restoration of project outcomes at the landscape level. And the second is to develop this approach that's consistent and has a coordinated assessment of restoration outcomes, so we can look at successes and failures. And the webpage for that is there. The vegetation change and monitoring system that we're introducing here will build upon and integrate with this overall effort. So our goals are threefold, really. It's summed up as broadly, we want to develop this biome-wide vegetation change monitoring and warning system. That will allow us to track changes in functioning sagebrush ecosystem components across the landscape. And hopefully we'll be able to provide warnings when deviations may have initiated for any given place across the landscape. Now we have lots of existing science, as I mentioned. Morgan did a great job characterizing how she's looking at invasive annual grasses and how the rate of change in invasive annual grasses really depends on the invasive annual cover. She showed this earlier today, and she presented maps, how we can use those to identify triages of where we might identify different management actions, whether to contain, protect, or treat those areas. And she moved on into talking about mechanisms that may be driving those, which would really help us understand how and why those changes are occurring and when we might want to get in there soon to identify those. A little plug for Beth Orning, who's going to be talking on the 27th, and she'll talk about an invasive annual grass economic assessment, where she's showing us how we can use state and transition simulation modeling to evaluate the potential efficacy of treating IIGs, invasive annual grasses, within core and other sagebrush rangelands, and then what resources it might take to stabilize those particular battles. So the expected outcomes for this vegetation monitoring and warning system are, we hope to be able to identify where and when undesired changes are changing in the vegetation components and when they're likely to occur. Secondly, we want to be able to assess a little bit of a typo there, potential benefits of management actions on ecosystem function, and then also ultimately produce maps showing when vegetation components are deviating from those trends in surrounding landscapes. Will eventually identify these sort of warnings. If you were with us a week ago, Pete Coates gave a great presentation on our shared work to develop novel approaches for identifying signals and thresholds of change for greater sage-grouse population trends. Here we identify when populations are declining, but also decoupling from neighborhood or surrounding populations. This is a great example of how we can implement a similar process for vegetation changes and understand how ecosystem processes may be altered or potentially altered before they decline to potential devastation. So as a simple example to demonstrate this using some RC map annual outputs from Matthew Riggy, we can assess vegetation responses to droughts. Let's focus on this green circle or green square that you see here in northeastern Wyoming and Campbell County, where precipitation in 1998 was much lower than average. And you can see this from the graph that I'm showing you here with the precipitation in blue in that 1998. We see this massive drop in typical precipitation and sort of a bit of a prolonged drought. And one of the easiest ways to see this response is in bare ground changes, where we see an over 50% increase in bare ground over that time. This is really interesting when you compare that to the long 5-year histories, and we can see the prolonged differences where the average bare ground you can see in the same box on the right map really highlights those increases in bare ground over that time. Should we be able to identify these changes going forward, we may be able to react and identify that those concerns might be coming, and maybe we could prevent these prolonged increases in bare ground, losses of vegetation, and die-offs in sagebrush and perennial grasses. So a vegetation monitoring system can help us really to understand where we might be able to resist those changes, such as going from an intact sagebrush cover within a site with less understory components. We don't want to transition that way if you look on sort of the y-axis here. So maybe able to resist this in this classic resist, accept, direct framework. We might also think about where we might need to accept some of these system changes, looking at into the future if we cannot change or really prevent those. From an adaptive management perspective, we really want to know how to intervene, where to intervene, but hopefully to prevent further degradation, or to really understand how and where we can potentially implement restoration, such as Brian was talking about earlier, and Erica, and successfully restore those sites. So Brian mentioned this, I'm not going to go into details, but we talked about we now have tools to identify restoration potential that can identify if we are degraded or declining in a certain way. We now have science that might help us understand the best processes to limit those degradations or potentially turn that signal down and restore vegetation conditions at those sites. This will be invaluable science as we implement this vegetation change monitoring and warning system to better help understand and manage ecosystem processes and recovery. So while this framework still really in its initial phases and a work in progress, you can see there's lots of science available coming from multiple different groups that will feed into this overall system. And here's a QR code where you can read a bit more about some of that science. We look forward to fully developing this in the future.
Got 2 quick talks left. The next one is I'm going to welcome back Morgan Roche from the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. I can see your slides, Morgan. Morgan's going to talk to us about vectors of invasive annual grass. So Morgan, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So this is a new start project. I'm not going to share any results yet, but wanted to kind of highlight the project and where we're going with it in the next couple of years. So we're super grateful to have received funding support from the Bureau of Land Management and from USGS Ecosystems Mission Area for this work. And also for the partnership between some really awesome minds at USGS, at BLM, at the Fish and Wildlife Service, and at CSU. So it's pretty well known that wildfire can facilitate invasive annual grasses, especially in sagebrush ecosystems with low resistance to invasion and resilience to disturbance or with repeated burning. But wildfires are certainly not the only disturbance in the system or the only disturbance driving annual grass invasion. So this figure shows the amount of area that has transitioned to invasive annual grass dominance in pink and unburned transitions in yellow. So you can see there's a pretty large area in that yellow that has converted to invasive annual grass dominance, not due to fire. So there's a need to understand what is driving the non-fire facilitated annual grass invasion and what kind of management actions could be used to limit those risks and where. So we also need to understand the conditions under which disturbance vector behavior is expected for any given disturbance and the consistency of vector behavior. So the climatic and ecological context may shape the risk of invasion from disturbance features. So we might expect that the same disturbance in two different locations, such as these two different photos of different sage ecosystems shown here, we might expect them to be pretty dramatically different vector behavior given the vegetation, climatic, and topographic factors that shape susceptibility to annual grass invasion in response to those particular disturbances. So we're planning on addressing two main questions. The first, we aim to understand which disturbances and processes act as vectors of invasion in sagebrush ecosystems. And then second, how much does the behavior, environmental context matter in determining vector behavior and consistency in vector behavior? So there are a lot of disturbance features that affect sagebrush landscapes that are suspected of contributing to invasive annual grass spread in certain conditions. I've just shown a handful of examples that we're considering here, but it's currently unclear which disturbances actually act as vectors of invasive annual grasses in contrast to disturbance features that don't really affect invasion risk, in contrast to those that have a high risk of invasion in some locations. So we're going to focus our initial analysis on two landscapes identified by the USGS Sagebrush Keystone Initiative team as areas. These are areas with high ecological integrity, but also high restoration capacity. And these also overlap BLM's Greater Sheldon Heart and Green River Basin restoration landscapes. So from a scientific perspective, comparison of these two really different landscapes that contrast in both disturbance regimes and data availability are going to be super useful for us for helping us identify vector behavior. So our first step is to determine which features act as vectors of annual grass invasion. So to do this, we're going to assess a variety of criteria with a combination of remotely sensed fractional component data and with plant plot data, such as BLM's AIM plots, to quantify the spatial and temporal properties of invasive annual grass patches near these disturbance features. So our first criteria is proximity to and percent cover of invasive annual grasses near a disturbance. This is pretty straightforward, but if a disturbance type consistently has limited presence or cover of invasive annual grasses, we can likely rule it out as a vector. We also plan to assess timing of invasion. So if invasive presence or cover increases following disturbance, that's also another line of evidence of vector behavior, in contrast to disturbances that were currently near invasive annual grasses, but those areas were perhaps already invaded. That doesn't necessarily rule it out, but it's not evidence for vector behavior. Our last criteria, at least for now, is direction of spread. So we expect features that act like vectors to have invasive annual grasses spreading from them or spreading along them, while features that aren't acting like vectors may have invasive cover, but that invasion is not originating from the feature. And throughout the talk, I'm picking on roads, but just because they're easy to draw. So don't take that as roads as our vectors specifically. So once we identify these criteria, we'll statistically evaluate the consistency of vector behavior and the factors that make features more likely to act as vectors. So these factors will include ecological contexts such as resistance and resilience, temperature, precipitation, drought severity, or invasion intensity, but also the vector context. So for example, are there multiple interacting vectors at a location? So like a road that bisects a grazing allotment versus one that doesn't, or the type of vector. So is it a diffuse vector like grazing or a discrete feature such as a road? So with this model, we'll be able to quantify the relative influence of different feature types on invasion in different conditions. And we'll be able to compare those results between those two focal landscapes. So the two landscape comparison will be pretty important for understanding how consistent vector behavior is for each of those features, and will inform potential for extrapolation to other areas. So how can managers use this vector threat information? So our outputs could be used to inform a variety of land use planning or disturbance management processes in sagebrush ecosystems. For example, in risky conditions, our results could be used to selectively decommission risky vectors, or to inform preferential placement of vectors in less risky landscapes, or they could be used to prioritize early detection and rapid response and monitoring on more risky vectors relative to those that are less risky. This is particularly important where vectors pose a risk to high value and intact ecosystems such as sage-grouse habitat. So we have a 2-year project that we just started up, and we anticipate that our results will start to come out in the fall of 26. Our main results will be published in a peer-reviewed manuscript, but we also plan on creating a vector threat map and an infographic that will be pretty broadly available. Both of those things will show kind of the relative importance of each disturbance as vectors of invasion, with estimated rates of invasion across spatial planning units. And all those data sets will also be released upon publication. All these things will end up on our project webpage, so please take a look at that and as we move forward. Thanks.
Okay, we've heard a lot today about invasive annual grass treatments. We talk a lot about getting return on our investments. We talk a lot about durability. It's one thing to get a return on the investment. It's another to protect those in the long term. And so I'm really excited about this next talk. Cara's going to talk to us about how do we protect these investments from fire. So Cara, I can see your slides. I can see your face. I can hear you. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Leif. So this project, we're fairly well underway, although deliverables will be later this year. So we won't be presenting any results. We do have results from a couple other very related projects that I'm going to show at the end. So this project is called Predicting Burn Risk to Land Management Investments, and it's in collaboration with the BLM. Sorry, I'm trying to move here and it's not letting me go. There. So as wildfires increase in size and severity in the western United States, it's becoming increasingly common for areas that burn once to experience reburning. So seeding and herbicide treatments on BLM lands are extensive, and a prior study found that nearly a fourth of the BLM seeding treatments have fully or partially burned over the last 30 years. Post-fire treatments, they represent a significant investment, and thus we need more information to understand whether the treatments affect that likelihood of the landscape reburning or the way that the fire moves across the landscape if they do reburn. We also need to understand when the treatments reburn, is that investment lost, or has the investment that's been put in with those treatments helped buffer the landscape against having poorer outcomes from reburning? So different landscapes are going to respond very differently to the effects of reburning. In areas where sagebrush seeding has occurred and that seeding was successful, if that area reburns, the sagebrush is fire intolerant and is not going to resprout. So that may represent a loss in investment. On the other hand, if area is drill seeded and has a really good establishment of perennial bunchgrass species, those grasses can often resprout and may be fairly resilient to reburning. And if it does reburn, the grasses may be able to resprout and resist invasion if the reburn does occur. So how do we assess this reburn risk to existing treatments? There has been some work by David Pilliod and sort of ongoing works looking back in time and looking at sort of statistical or probabilistic occurrences of treatments reburning. We're taking a little bit of a different focus on this and looking at it empirically. So Jake Price is my co-lead on this project, and he is a really great fire modeler. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the probability of reburning to different land management treatments using FLAM map modeling with 5 different weather scenarios. So that's the step 1 right here. Where we're running all these different scenarios, looking at landscapes and how the treatments affect that reburn probability across the landscape. And this is mostly what I'm going to focus on right now because this is where we're funded. These steps 2 and 3, we have a little bit of work on the 2 done, but those are going to be sort of future steps in later years. So the step 2 is looking at identifying if the treatments do reburn, where is there a negative ecological response to reburning? So specifically, where is more likely to be invaded if that reburning does occur? And then once we have that both step 1 and step 2, we can put them together and create maps of this, what we're calling reburn hazard. So that's a combined effect of the probability of reburning and then also having a negative ecological outcome to that reburning. So I'm going to focus here on our methods for the step 1. So in order to create realistic scenarios of the landscape and to understand how the fires will move through them and through these treatments that have been done on the landscape, we need to be able to create realistic fuel maps of the landscape. And Jake has done a lot of previous work on this, on helping us really get good fuel maps for sagebrush steppe, because a lot of the fuel maps that have already been created really came from forest models and were not really very realistic in sagebrush steppe. And so what we do is we do a whole bunch of field plots across the landscape. We relate those field plots to the rangelands analysis platform vegetation cover so that we can sort of get a combined benefit of having both the remote sensing and the field data. Then we take that vegetation cover and translate it to this fire behavior fuel model. So these are the specific categories that we have to feed into FLAM map in order for them to tell them what fuels is there so they can run the fire model. And then the step 3 of this is trying to understand that effective treatment on fire behavior and fuel models. So we have a lot of field data that we fed into this from multiple different projects to look at how fire behavior fuel models are different between areas that are treated and untreated. And once we have that effect, we can essentially subtract those treatments from the landscape to create these counterfactual maps of untreated landscapes and compare what the fire behavior would be on a landscape that has been treated versus has not been treated. And here we're going to look specifically at drill seeding, aerial seeding of shrubs, and herbicide use. We're going to be running these simulations for 3 different study locations. So these are all fires that there was one fire that occurred, and most of the second fires are about 9 to 10 years afterwards. So one in northern Nevada that had these 2 different fires occur. We have the Soda Jump Fire that occurred across the Oregon-Idaho border. And then a set of fires at Craters of the Moon National Park about 9 years apart. And so these are the landscapes that we're going to be running the FLAM map scenarios on to understand the effects of the treatments that were done there. We're leveraged to create the models to create the models that give us that crosswalk between the vegetation cover and the fire behavior fuel model. We're actually parameterizing those models with over 3,000 plot year data points from the field that were collected for a range of other different fires across the entire Great Basin. So here's some potential outcomes, and we're really building on work that Jake has already done here. So one of the things we're pretty excited about as an outcome from this project is that Jake has already created this field guide for classifying standard fire behavior fuel models in sagebrush steppe to help sort of define what different fuel types look like that we're trying to put into these models. With all this data that we're now feeding into the models, we're going to be able to really get a standardized model to convert vegetation cover to the FBFM model for different types of monitoring. So for like ocular estimates versus LPI versus grid point intercept. So we can feed that into a model and just easily be able to convert vegetation cover to FBFM. Here are some examples of work that Jake's done using the fuel models that he's created to simulate fire risk. And he's compared this with just the standard land fire fuel mapping that you get to put into FlamMap. And one of the things he's found is that there's really a large disagreement between what land fire tells you the fire risk is and then what the field-based fuel models tell you. So we're really excited to be able to have this process by which we can really improve the fuel mapping, which we think is going to be able to give us a much better method of getting accurate burn risk. This is additionally some more comparison he's done between land fire and the field-based FBFM maps. So he was trying to recreate a wildfire that already occurred, the Soda wildfire, and found that there was pretty poor agreement with the actual fire boundary when land fire was used. But when this sort of RAP-informed and field data-informed fuel map was created, the simulation agreement with the actual fire boundary was pretty good. And so what this tells us is that we have fairly high confidence in these burn risk maps if we're able to create very accurate field maps or fuel maps from them. This is one final additional project that Matt and Jake did. So this is looking at how fuel breaks affect simulated fire behavior. And in this study, they identified a target percent cover of sagebrush and exotic annual grass that was needed to keep flame lengths under a certain size that were containable with different methods. So, the flame lengths you'd need to be able to contain fires with heavy equipment versus hand tools, and then getting down in this lower cover range, it would be fairly containable. So we're going to be expanding a lot on this work to really get at those specific cover thresholds for the different fuel types that should be applicable really across the entire Great Basin. So for our expected products here, we're going to have the updated FBFM guide relating field-based cover estimates to FBFM for several different types of methods. The maps of reburn probability in the year prior to actual reburn on 3 landscapes. So that's the Soda, Laidlaw, and Snowstorm. And then the primary deliverable will be a peer-reviewed publication discussing the impact of post-fire treatments on reburn risk. And with that, I'd like to thank our BLM collaborators and all of the field technicians who helped us collect field data to parameterize these models. And I'm going to put the website in the chat. When we get deliverables, they will be posted up there.
All right.